at these conferences, they always make you repeat it. So let's just get it over with and get loud, okay? Welcome. Good afternoon. Thank you. That was very validating. I will be your MC for these two amazing panels. My name is Danielle Beavers from the Greenlighting Institute, based in Oakland, California. We are a racial justice and economic justice advocacy group, and to be honest, I had very much avoided coming out here since January. But I can tell you it's been so energizing and refreshing, and I just feel like I'm ready to go, and just to see so many fierce advocates in all different places, right? The corporate sector, the government sector, nonprofits. It's been truly wonderful. And so I'm just very honored to be on this panel. Thank you very much. Just to tell you a little bit about Greenlighting's work, we're twofold. So we're in policy, and we're working at industries that are driving our economy. And of course, some of that is going to look at products and services in places like insurance, in the banking sector, in the environmental sector. But we also work on jobs, believing that that's the strongest economic asset and a key to racial equity. And so we use diversity, workforce diversity, supplier diversity, as a tool, as a lever point to increase jobs for folks of color. And of course, we all know that the tone gets set at the top in many of these places, and that's why board diversity is so critical. And these amazing panelists are going to give us some insight into what's been going on from a regulatory standpoint and from a corporate policy standpoint to increase that. I'm going to share one of my favorite quotes from Dr. MLK to kick us off on here. Morality cannot be legislated, but behavior can be regulated. Judicial decrees may not change the heart, but they can restrain the heartless. And so with that, I want to welcome up here the two gentlemen that made this panel possible, and want to thank you for your leadership. Of course, being Representative Gregory Meeks, Senior Member of the House Financial Services and Foreign Affairs Committee, and Representative G.K. Butterfield, immediate past Chair of the CBC and Member of the Energy and Commerce Committee. Please welcome me and join me.
Famous last words. Am I first? And she said, yes, you are. Let me begin by saying good afternoon to all of you, and thank you so very much for coming out to have a part in this conversation. This is a very important conversation that we all must have. Thank you to the panelists for your willingness to share your time today to give us insights on these topics and many more as you see fit. But let me just very quickly say that I am the immediate past chair of the Congressional Black Caucus. My 2 years ended December 31st of last year, thank God. It was a very interesting 2 years. As CBC chair, you have a lot of responsibilities, and you also bring in your platform and your vision of the future. When I became chair of the CBC, my unrealistic vision was that I wanted to analyze the data from the Fortune 500 companies and determine how well each was doing with diversity and inclusion. So we collected the data, and it was absolutely appalling. Among the Fortune 5 companies, 200 of those had no African Americans at all on their boards. Another 200 had one, and the other 100 obviously had more than one. And so that's where we started and realized that at the board level, the diversity was very lacking. Then we looked at the C-suites, and some of that data was available, some of it was not available, but we looked at that data and came to the same conclusion that it was absolutely appalling. And then we looked at entry level, we looked at supplier diversity and the whole gamut of corporate existence. And we came to the conclusion that it was absolutely disgusting, and that either we could just get mad and cuss them out, or we could be constructive, and we could reach out to the companies and try to have constructive conversation, and that's where we started. We realized that of the Fortune 500 companies, they collectively have revenues in excess of $12 trillion in revenue among the Fortune 500 companies. Many of these companies have as their consumer base, their customer base, African Americans and other minorities in our great country. And so we realized that this was an opportunity for the Congressional Black Caucus to lift up these issues and to make a difference. But then we were lacking in resources. Obviously, we didn't have the resources to take on 500 companies with $12 trillion in revenue. And so we just isolated the technology companies, the top 20 technology companies. We isolated those, realizing that among the 20 technology companies, not a single one had an African American on their board of directors, and they would be the names that all of you would recognize, and they were very deficient. And so we embarked upon a program called CBC Tech 2020. We developed a list of protocol and a list of companies that we wanted to deal with, and we started dealing with these companies one at a time. Got on an airplane, went out to Silicon Valley several times and had that conversation with the diversity officers, and in many cases, with the CEO of the company. If there's one takeaway that we got from those visits was that unless, and I don't know how the panelists feel about this, but unless the CEO buys into the advantages and the necessity for diversity and inclusion, it's probably not going to happen at the company. And so it starts at the top. And so we were surprised. We were surprised with the reaction we received from CEOs, because they sat in the boardrooms and talked with us and said, look, guys, we get it. We understand that there's a correlation between our profit and the diversity of our company. We get that. And so we want to reach out to you as a Congressional Black Caucus to help us with our diversity goals. And that was very impressive. And for those companies that we work with who may be represented in the room, thank you. I won't call you by name, but thank you so very much for opening up your arms to this conversation. Finally, we talked about internships. We talked about recruitment on campuses of HBCUs, and hopefully we are beginning to see an uptick in that as well. So I want to thank you for coming. I know Congressman Gregory Meeks, my dear, dear friend from Queens, New York. He doesn't like to just say New York. He likes to say Queens, New York. And so I've gotten in the habit over the last years of repeating him. Queens, New York. Greg is a great friend. He's a great member of Congress. Those of you from his district, please keep him in Congress, because he's a vital resource. He is the chairman of our Congressional Black Caucus Political Action Committee. He's a senior member on the Home Foreign Affairs Committee, and you see him on television all the time talking about foreign affairs, stuff that I know very little about. And he's on the committee on I drawn a blank, financial services. It used to have another name. The Committee on Financial Services, probably in the top 5, maybe in seat number 3 or 4 on that committee. So thank you, Greg Meeks, for coming together and allowing me to be a part of this program. And let's have a good conversation today. Thank you very much.
Let's give GK another hand. Because, indeed, when he became chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, he changed its focus to make sure that we were dealing on the corporate level. We've got a lot of responsibilities as members of the Congressional Black Caucus. GK comes from North Carolina and probably represents one of the poorest districts in America. One of the poorest districts in America. And so he understands the plight of individuals who need to own a home or need to feed their families and don't have resources to do much of anything, and he's focused on that. But he also understands that unless we deal with the C-suites in corporate America, that we will not be whole as a people. And we have to develop and move on both levels. And so GK came to the Congress and, as chair of the CBC, made sure that it addressed the issues of all Americans, but especially those of African Americans. And that's one of the reasons why we're here. He's an expert on energy and commerce. And we know what that means. And as we move forward, because I look at this, I say, we're in what I call the second phase of the civil rights movement. The second phase of the civil rights movement. And the second phase of the civil rights movement is economics. And it is to make sure that we're able to move forward and that we have access to where the money is. Because I always tell folks, we as a people should not be afraid of money. Because sometimes they make you think that if you're after money or if you have money, if you're earning money, that it's a bad thing. It is not. You're not free unless there is the economic means of taking care of yourself. I like to talk about the 3 E's. Education and economics equals empowerment. And that's what this is about, because we've seen doors locked. GK talked about going to see CEOs on the West Coast. Well, I'm from New York. I go down to Wall Street, and when I went into Wall Street, go into some of the firms, they know I'm coming. They probably figure out the question I'm going to ask. So they try to find somebody somewhere that look like me. And inevitably, they bring somebody, and I look, and I ask them, well, where are you working? Oh, I'm the receptionist on the 3rd floor. Those days have got to stop. And so that's why I am first thankful to TD Bank for their sponsorship of this event. And you're going to hear from Brother Alan Love to wrap up the program. He is the Vice President and Head of Anti-Money Laundering. And we will offer a few words, but Alan, stand up so everyone can see you. Thank you for sponsoring this particular event. And then there is our moderators that we have here. Of course, Ms. Halliger and my good friend and brother. And, you know, I've got to say this, so you know, there's always got to be a first in certain things. So he is my alpha brother, Lloyd Douglas. Thank you. I want to thank each and every panelist. Some made many sacrifices to be here to join us today. And they are talented with great information that they were ready, willing to share with all. In fact, they were very anxious to share it because they want to make a difference and they want things to change. Let me just briefly say and give a brief background on what took place in 2009. And some of it starts on a local level. Many of it for individuals, when you talk about public retirement funds particularly, they look like many of the people in this room. And so when you have state and city controllers starting to ask, well, who are we giving this money to manage? And what kind of diversity do you have on your boards? Because we know it makes a difference. And if you don't have someone of diverse nature, then we can't give you those dollars. I know we've made that a criteria for whoever is the controller of the state of New York or the city of New York. We want to know what you're going to do with those pensions. How are you going to invest it? Number one, it's good business, because all evidence shows that when a firm gives their money to someone who has diversity, it is a better investment. They make more money. So it's a good business decision on the part of the controllers to try to make sure that there's diversity. And so what we wanted to do is to try to make sure that we put some rules in place. So the SEC issued its board diversity rule in 2009. And one of our panelists, who was the SEC commissioner, and his name is Commissioner Aguilar, he was the proponent. He was the one that started. He says, we got to get this done. We owe him a debt of gratitude. So the SEC came out with a rule. Now, after the rule came out, some could be quiet and say, okay, we did it. But not Commissioner Aguilar. he made the comment after the rule came out that despite the rule, companies did not disclose any useful information at all, that we needed to go further. He said despite the rule, companies did not disclose any concrete steps that they would take to create a diverse board. The rule also failed to define diversity, which makes it difficult for us to access or assess the race, gender, ethnic composition of the boards that do not provide robust disclosures. You know, one of the things that I have gotten involved in, looked at recently, and I've talked to my governor and a few other folks about it, we have these MWBE programs that's supposed to be for minorities. And we get these standards and we put in numbers that we got a 30% requirement for MBEs. Now, it's important because many of these MBEs, you know, the way that you know them and you attract them is if you have somebody that's on the boards that's going to make sure that they're including them in, because it's that networking that goes forward. But what we found was that even in those 30%, that we need to break it down by ethnicity. Because oftentimes if you did not do that, you found that African Americans in particular were still only getting 5% of that 30%. And so that's why it is important when we're talking about the rule in regard to information to diversify boards, we've got to get all of the information so that we can then hold them accountable when they come before, when the SEC commissioner comes before us, as will take place in October. So I can tell you right now that Maxine Waters is gearing up. Emmanuel Cleaver is gearing up. Al Green is gearing up. Keith Ellison is gearing up. Joyce Beatty is gearing up. And Gregory Meeks is gearing up for when he comes before us to start to talk about the enforcement of this rule. Because what took place, you know, the former chair, Mary Jo White, we had a commitment from her to make sure that we put some strength and some teeth behind the rule and define what diversity is. But under this new administration, we don't have any assurity that he's going to follow through on the last mandates that Mary Jo White had put forward. So the way that we can try to make sure that we hold people accountable is when they come before us to make sure that we put these things on the record and we continue to press. Now we're here at 2017. It is the Congressional Black Caucus, but I have to remind everyone that we have 2018 elections. And all I will say about that, because the Congressional Black Caucus Foundations are not for profit, but elections have consequences. Elections have consequences. So now, in January, I introduced a bill called Improving the Corporate Governance Through Diversity Act, which requires public companies and federal contractors to release data on racial, ethnic, and gender diversity of the boards and senior management teams. This is something that we want to push and make law. One consequence of the SEC's board diversity rules shortcomings is the difficulty of gathering statistics on the racial diversity of public companies. So we want to make sure that happens. Now, why is it important, and why do I say these elections are important? Let me just end on this. Got to end on a little bit of politics. It makes a difference who is in charge. It makes a difference who is in charge. Should, and I'm not, you know, the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation is a 501c3 and it's a not-for-profit organization, so I'm not going to deal with all of that. I'm not talking about that, but I want to say what would happen should the thing flip and Democrats were in control, because I've had this dialogue with someone, and these are just facts. If it changed, a lot of the issues that we're talking about, diversity and others, would change because the chairs of the committees would change. So on behalf of the Congressional Black Caucus, for example, when I talk about criminal justice reform, which we're not talking about here, but John Conyers would be chair of the Judiciary Committee, who controls that area. When we talk about science and technology, Eddie Bernice Johnson would be chair of that committee. When we talk about education, Bobby Scott would be chair of that committee. When we talk about holding the government in check and government oversight, Elijah Cummings would be chair of that committee. When you talk about Homeland Security, Benny Thompson would be chair of that committee. And when you talk about financial services, Maxine Waters would be chair of that committee. So we're talking about power. And we're talking about now changing something so you're not just talking rhetoric, but we can make a difference. And we're talking about trying to make sure that we spread the wealth. Because the one thing I would say about board diversity, which we got to make sure stops happening, is also we've got to look at the profiles of the individuals who we put on these boards. You know, I look at some of the people that we do put on boards. I don't see anybody, some need to be from HR, for example, who knows how to do things and then look through the community of that corporation to make sure there's more diversity there. And we've got to make sure that we don't just use one or two people. Because what I've noticed also, and this is what you get one or two people, and you put those one or two people on all of the boards and lock out everybody else. And let me tell you, from my time being in Congress, there is talent in America by people who look like the people in this room, and they're not being utilized. And so the idea here is to have these panels to talk about what we can do, what we should do, how we can stand together to make a difference and make America better. Thank you. God bless.
Thank you for your leadership, representatives. I'd like to introduce your moderator for the first panel. His name is Ide Helliger, a partner at Weil Public Company Advisory Group, where he advises U.S. public companies, corporate boards, and foreign private issues on SEC matters. Please feel free to check out his full bio in the ALC app. Thank you.
Great. Hello, can you hear me? Thanks, everyone. Thanks, everyone, for coming. As mentioned, I am Ade Helliger. I'm a partner at Weil Gottschall's DC office in our Public Company Advisory Group. Before I introduce my impressive panel, I just wanted to say again, repeat again, a quick thank you to our hosts, Representative Butterfield, Representative Meeks. Representative Meeks, when we first came here, I lived in Jamaica, Queens, so former constituents. So the topic of board diversity, it's a hot topic these days, but I believe we have a fantastic opportunity with the panel that we have to really approach this matter from three sort of unique perspectives. From that of the regulator, the SEC, who adopted a rule governing board diversity. From that of the shareholder, who is using its power and its investment power and its voting power to push for greater diversity. And from that of the board member inside the boardroom to give insights as to how boards are actually responding to these efforts. Now, as Representative Meeks mentioned, the SEC does actually have a rule covering board diversity. It's Regulation SK item 407C2 for anyone who wants to take a look at it. And what that rule requires for companies who are subject to that rule, requires companies to disclose whether or not in considering board nominees, diversity is a factor. If so, how is that factoring into the process? And how does a company... Sorry. Okay. Is that better? Yes. Okay, great. Sorry about that. I won't start over, don't worry. So the SEC's rule looks to how is the diversity a factor, and how does a company assess its effectiveness of its board diversity policy. Now, the rule has what some may consider a tiny loophole, as Representative Meeks mentioned, in that it does not actually define diversity. So companies are not required to assess diversity on such traditional metrics as race, gender, or ethnicity, but instead are free to consider diversity on other broader criteria, such as diversity of experience or geographic diversity. And so as a result of that, you can have, arguably a board comprised solely of gray-haired white men, which may be considered a diverse board if, for example, that company measures diversity based on boarding school attendance or the fact that some went to a certain Ivy League and some went to another. Why was the rule adopted and drafted that way? I don't know. Fortunately for us, however, we have one of the few people in the room where it happened who can give some insights into that, and that's former SEC Commissioner Luis Aguilar, who's here with us today. Commissioner Aguilar served at the SEC from July 2008 through December 2015. He currently serves on the boards of 3 public companies, I believe. He joined Falcon Cyber Investments as a partner in 2016 and has always been a strong proponent of board diversity. I don't think the rule would have actually been adopted if it weren't for the efforts of Commissioner Aguilar. So welcome, sir.
Thank you, Ade. Pleased to be here. And really, for future reference, please never have me follow Congressman Meeks. It just goes downhill from there, I think. Hopefully the rest of my panels will lift us all up. I'm delighted to be here. And I'm glad to get an applause for having passed one of the weakest rules the SEC has ever passed. It's a strange way to get for some recognition. But let me just give you some sort of quick facts. And in fact, I'm going to have 2 people stand up because some of this you may not believe, and so you may talk to them afterwards. They were at the commission, so somewhat of the insights. And that's one of my former staffers who ended up working for Chairman Mary Jo White, Lavan Jama. And a gentleman in the back that ended up being the SEC's first and maybe short-lived after he left, Chief Diversity Officer Ron Crawford. I won't mention others. Those 2 were there and can speak. We had a market crash in 2008. In 2009, we thought that there's probably some enhancements we can make to the proxy disclosure process for boards, and which we did, including things from enhanced compensation disclosures to discussion of compensation consultants to greater disclosure of equity, et cetera. In that process, I was aware, and evidently I was the only one aware, that in 2003, when the SEC last did proxy disclosure enhancement, and it put out a proposal, it did not even mention the word diversity, not once. And lo and behold, if investors with over $3 trillion, that's with a T, of assets called the SEC, reached out to the SEC, wrote the SEC letters, said, you know what we really would like is we'd like disclosure around diversity, race, gender, ethnicity in particular. So 2008 comes along, 2009, I'm doing this, and I said to myself, well, that was a good idea then. It's probably still a good idea now. I reached out to some investors, says, still a good idea, right? Absolutely, overwhelming. So I then went to my fellow commissioners, and I won't mention individuals by name, but it was 3 women and 2 Hispanics. I thought this may be the easiest thing I ever do as a commissioner. Turned out that it wasn't. So won't get into all the gory details, but I started off with the kind of rule you guys were advocating for, that Commissioner Stringer just sent a letter to 151 companies asking for, that the petition from the pension funds last year with over $1 trillion asked for. But at the time, quite frankly, there was no takers. So much negotiation, give and take, head counts taken, and at a point in time, we don't need your vote for this, so, we're not going to put anything in there. One negotiates other things because the rule had other things that I thought were important, so I continued the good old fight. Eventually, I managed to put in 2 sentences. This is from the expression, from little acorn, mighty oaks can grow if you continue to water and tend them. But in a 137-page document, I managed to bury 2 questions on page 31. And I'll just read them to you because they're very short. Should we amend item 407C2 to require additional factors that a nominating committee considers when selecting someone, comma, such as diversity, question mark? Should we amend our rules to require additional or different disclosures related to diversity, question mark? That's it. 2 sentences in a lengthy rule. I, however, at the open commission voted on this, turned half of my speech into this 2 sentences diversity rule to make sure people didn't miss it or oversee it. And telling people it's there. To some extent, it's now up to you investors and shareholders to write in and tell us that you consider this to be important. I then went out and gave 3 public speeches in the space of a month and a half just to make sure it wasn't lost. Lo and behold, we had an overwhelming amount of support for a diversity rule. Many letters, not all 100% in support, but 90% in support, and then, if you will, the usual 10%. I then went to my fellow commissioners and said, see, still important, we ought to do it. Further discussions, pushback particularly on defining diversity and the way we would think about diversity. But ultimately, and I've publicly spoken about this, I made the bet that in the long run I would be right. It seemed to be that I pushed it as far as I could. So we provided the rule that Adi mentioned earlier to at least require you to think about diversity, and yes, you'll define it as diversity of thought perhaps. I said, and I said publicly and have been consistently, I think the public, the shareholders, will know those that are stepping up to the plate and will know those that are dancing around. They will laud those that have done the right thing and are making the right disclosures, and hopefully they will take to task those that don't. Then, every year we get the proxy season, as Lamont will tell you. Every year I would make myself down to the Corp Fin offices that are reviewing proxy statements and would ask for special attention to this issue. And many companies were, quite frankly, ignoring it. Even with the loose diversity definition, we're ignoring it. I made sure they got letters from the SEC. Did this for 3, 4, 5 years, as long as I was there, I guess. And then, watched what I hope would unfurl. Companies that were doing the right thing were being lauded, those others were taken to task. And what other things happened? Going back 5 years, every year, various groups, the Coalition of 30, number of other groups would do shareholder requests of some of the bigger companies saying we want this kind of disclosure. Groups were getting significant letters, and over the time, if you look at it, and the bigger the company, the more adherence they are, I think, to the spirit of what we were trying to do. S&P 100's better than S&P 500's, S&P 500's better than Russell 3000's, Russell 3000 better than others. And so if you look at the numbers, the S&P 100's, that's where you find, I think most of your African American, most of your Asians, and most of your directors, which isn't saying much, okay? Just to give you some quick statistics, as of last year, S&P companies, 21% members are women, 5% African Americans, 3% Asians, 2% Hispanics. So not exactly anything to pat our backs about, but on the larger companies are doing better. Imagine how the smaller companies are doing. So that was the process. That's how we got the rule. Yes, I knew it was weak at the time, but I figured silence wasn't going to help anybody. At least this would allow us to have some insights into how some companies view it, and that we would see the ones that were doing the dance to duck it, and we would see the ones that aren't. And over time, it's gotten better. For those that are still in the shadows, or perhaps more than that are still in the dark ages, what are you seeing lately? You're seeing State Street picking women up and saying that they're going to vote no across the board to non-committee chairs if they don't see any women on those boards. I'm hoping, and I've told the CIO of State Street that I'm hoping that they expand that view to people of color as well. I think they will. And in fact, some of the verbiage at some of the documents they've had indicate that's not lost on them. Of course, what happened within the last 10 days, and I commend you to read the letter that they sent in the matrix that they sent to the 151 companies by the New York pension funds. It's directly on point. And it addresses race and gender directly on point. And I think they've hope they will have success, and I think the things will cascade. So that's a little bit of the story. Yes, it wasn't lost on me that it was weak, but it was also, you know, it also at the time thought this was a way to launch the issue, and that hopefully will pick up steam, and hoping committees, panels such as this, actions such as Congressman Meek has taken, letters that he's written to Chairman Clayton will have an effect to get us all to where we need to be and actually join the 21st century, which as far as I can tell, we're long overdue. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Aguilar knew what he was doing. Commissioner Aguilar knew what he was doing in 2009. We needed to get a rule in so we could start the discussion. He wasn't going to get everything he wanted, but if we could get something on the books, we could definitely start a discussion about this. I want to quickly introduce the remainder of our panel, and then we can continue our discussion. We have Michelle Hooper here. Michelle Hooper is President and CEO of the Directors Council, which provides board advisory and search services. Michelle Hooper is currently on the board of PPG, United Health. I think you were on the board of Target, AstraZeneca at one point, Warner Music. She was voted, I didn't see this on your bio, but I saw this, Michelle. She was voted as one of the top 10 directors to have on your company's board by the street. She was received her first directorship at the age of 38. So that's, what, about 2 years ago, Michelle? Michelle Hooper. What we're also going to talk about today, and now introducing my final two panelists, what we're going to talk about today is, in the absence of a rule change that would actually require disclosures of racial, ethnic, gender diversity, what we're seeing is shareholders using their position, their voting power, and their investment power to force change, to push efforts to increase board diversity. And we're fortunate enough to have with us here today representatives from CalPERS and from BlackRock. We have first CalPERS, the U.S. largest public pension fund with $300 billion in assets. That's a billion with a B. CalPERS carries a big stick and can force change. And we have from the CalPERS board, Henry Jones, who's also chairs the investment committee, and I learned last week was a former CFO of the Los Angeles area school district, with us here at the end. And in terms of big sticks, big shareholder sticks, we have Michelle Edkins from BlackRock. BlackRock has, according to Forbes, I saw 5.7 trillion with a T in assets under management. And we've heard about the efforts recently of the State Streets, of the CalPERS, and such to push for greater diversity at the companies within which they invest. And BlackRock was certainly at the forefront of those efforts as well. And Michelle Edkins spearheads those efforts at BlackRock, managing a team of 30 specialists around the globe in their investment and voting activities at the companies within which BlackRock invests. So we've got two big sticks here, two big shareholder sticks who are really pushing for increased diversity. So I'd like to turn it over to Michelle Edkins and Henry to speak to the efforts that their respective companies are taking to push the needle on increased diversity.
Okay. Lovely, thanks, and good afternoon, everybody. Sorry, I'm just going to make sure I can get this close enough so you can hear me. Pardon?
Don't worry, she'll let you know. Let us know.
I think it's working. I just get a bit closer. So BlackRock has been engaging companies globally on diversity in boardrooms and in senior executive leadership for a number of years. A lot of this actually started in other markets around the financial crisis as well, where there was a general sense that board quality wasn't sufficient to guide and oversee management, and one of the components of that was the homogeneity of the average boardroom. As many of you will know, in a lot of other markets, there are now quotas for gender diversity. Given there is no credible threat of any kind of quota in the US, we believe it's absolutely up to the private sector, both on the investor side and the corporate side, to work together to make this happen. Now, the reason that BlackRock looks at board diversity is not actually out of a sense of fairness. All of that $5.7 trillion that we manage is our clients' money. And we have a very diverse spectrum of clients, some of whom have very strong views on a number of issues that might be called social issues, many of whom have never expressed any of those kind of views to us. So in terms of acting in our fiduciary duty for those clients, the one thing they all have in common is they've asked us to generate returns on their assets. So while there is a positive outcome on the fairness criteria, the driver for us is board quality and board effectiveness. And why that's important is boards, as leaders of a company, ensure the sustainability in a financial sense of that company, and therefore it's hugely important for the long-term financial success that every boardroom has the best people possible in it. Now, why is diversity part of that equation? And I'm sure I don't really have to explain it to you, but I just want to talk you through our thinking, is that there is a lot of evidence that diverse groups take better decisions. They nearly always find it harder to get to that decision because people with different experiences, different perspectives, different risk profiles, or many, many other factors, will look at things differently. But there's another important thing that the research shows, and that is that visible diversity is hugely important. And this comes back to basic human behavior. If someone sitting opposite or around the same table as you doesn't look like you, you don't make assumptions about what they're thinking, you don't mimic their behavior, and you challenge their approach and their arguments more thoughtfully because you know they're different. And that is hugely important in a decision-making body, that you really kick the tires, that you really question whether you do have a common understanding, where you explore all the options and you don't just assume that you know what the other person believes. And boards are ultimately decision-making bodies. That's what they do. Too much of the conversation is around the compliance component of being a board member, but ultimately boards are making fundamental decisions about strategy, about capital expenditure, about regulatory compliance, and so on, that ensure companies have a sustainable financial future. One of the real issues in the lack of diversity in boardrooms is the nominating process. And the Commissioner mentioned what information nominating committees should disclose. And the reason that is important is not just their thinking about diversity, but what is their appointment process? Because, again, a lot of data shows that the vast majority, ballpark 80% of board appointments are made through incumbent directors' networks. Now, that's not a bad thing necessarily. That is human behavior as well. And boards are made up of human beings, and I know you know that, but it's not surprising that human behavior plays out so strongly in the boardroom. They're not immune to, board directors are not immune to it. But how do we change that such that directors have more diverse networks? Now, this is a Black caucus, so a lot of people here are African American, but if you only network in your own group, then you're not going to be meeting the people who are in the decision-making roles in boardrooms. And that's true for people of any dimension of diversity. And so one of the questions that we ask when we engage boards and management about diversity in the boardroom is, how does their nominating process work? And how do they ensure that they are being deliberate? And deliberate is the point, about looking for directors in places they've not looked before. Because it's really easy just to go to your normal sources. It is harder to look elsewhere, but it is incredibly important to do so. There's another dimension on this, not just about board quality and quality of decision making, but about talent, attraction and retention. Now, every single company that we invest in says in one way or another that they are in a war for talent. Now, is the American workforce homogenous? No, it is not. If you are trying to attract the best talent, and it's the best graduates coming out of college, the best graduates coming out of high school, it doesn't matter which segment of the economy or qualifications you're looking at, that is a diverse group of people. And to attract and retain talent, you need to demonstrate that people coming into your company have a career trajectory. And again, there's evidence that shows that when people can look into the senior ranks, both at executive and board level, and see people who look different to the dominant culture, if they also look different to the dominant culture, they believe they have a career path there. And when you think about how much companies are investing in developing their people and so on, that is a hugely important thing to be able to do, to retain the people that you want to have at the company. And this is another dimension through which we are looking at diversity. Now, another private sector initiative that I think is very valuable is a number of universities, and Harvard is the one that we're most aware of, is working on developing, in a rather clumsy sense, it's called human capital management statistics, and setting out disclosures on many dimensions of diversity and retention and employee engagement within the workforce. And I think that connects really importantly with who people see in the boardroom. I just want to make one last point about the appointment process, and that is that technology is disrupting that process now. So there are specialist advisory services, such as the one that Michelle's leading, and others that help in a sort of very hands-on way. But there are also technology platforms that enable diverse candidates to register, and companies looking for diverse candidates to search those databases at relatively low cost and see the wealth of talent that's out there. Because one of the perverse things is, for the people who don't want to change, they think there's a supply problem. And for the people who want to get into boardrooms, they see it as a demand problem. And actually, it's much more in the middle. It's about being deliberate on the board or the corporate side for looking in different places, finding the supply, and on the demand side, being deliberate about networking differently and being visible to the people who can put you in a board.
Thanks very much, Michelle, for that overview. I think, as I said, we can debate whether or not we'll see a change under the current administration and in the current climate with respect to the board diversity rule that we currently have on the books. But there are shareholders here who are not, we're not holding their breaths and who are taking action. And as Michelle noted, they're not just taking action because this is board diversity is a social good, but they're taking action because there's a real and true economic benefit they see in increased board diversity. So I'd like to flip it to Henry to speak to CalPERS as well has engaged in not only a petition to amend the current rule that's on the books, but also has engaged the companies within which CalPERS invests and push them for increased board diversity as well. If you could maybe spend a few minutes on the efforts there at CalPERS.
Sure, be glad to. Is this on? Can you hear me? Okay, yeah, be glad to. But before I make a few comments, I just want to make an observation of 2 points. On when you mentioned CalPERS, $300 billion, I went like that because it's 200 $324 billion, and I don't want to lose $24 billion.
I do not want to owe you $24 billion.
I read
but
the papers in the morning and it says CalPERS lost $24 billion. I can't go home. Yeah, and I also like to comment on the commissioner's comment because the letters that he mentioned and the $3 trillion that he mentioned of various firms and pension funds supporting those efforts, CalPERS was certainly part of that group. And CalPERS is also part of other groups that try to make change with the support of people like Commissioner Aguilar, and that's the Council of Institutional Investors, which is another organization that is comprised of pension funds, both public and private, that represent probably over $2 trillion in assets. And so we are hitting this from a lot of different angles because it is so important, and we're trying to leverage every outcome, opportunity we have to make these changes. Because the bottom line is, simply put, board diversity makes good business sense. And CalPERS has been engaged in corporate governance for at least the last 25 years. And I've been on the board now for 8 years, but they've been engaging companies over the last 25 years. And of course, diversity has been highlighted significantly, at least over the last decade. These corporate boards are fiduciaries for our pension members. We invest in their companies to get the returns to pay our benefits. So they truly are beneficiaries, fiduciaries for our beneficiaries. And so we want boards to represent a diverse mix of characteristics, experiences, and competencies to ensure that board leadership is taking care of our money for our members. And you know, research shows that companies in the top quartile for gender diversity and racial and ethnic diversity are respectively 15% and 35% more likely to have financial returns above their respective national industry members. And that's from a report from McKinsey in 2015 titled Why Diversity Matters. So CalPERS has long advocated, as I mentioned, to increase board disclosure and representation of diverse characteristics such as gender, age, gender identity, and sexual orientation, culture and ethnic composition, and historically underrepresented groups. And and we've been fostering these efforts for, like I said, some time now, but it's a lot of work left to be done, and we will continue to engage going forward. And as a global investor, CalPERS is focused on long-term value because we have to press up on companies. It's not a short-term return. We're looking at long-term value because we have members starting to work in the CalPERS plan. A 20-year-old now worked 20, 30, 40 years and then retires, and then we have to pay his benefits for another 20 years or so. So you can see why we have to be sure that when we're investing in these companies that we're looking at the long-term value, because that's what we believe that this diversity is going to help us achieve. So then we had adopted a set of policies at CalPERS dealing with this human financial and capital. And so the human side of it is making sure that you have diverse workers. The financial side is making sure that you have boards that are going to be diverse enough to get the returns we need to together get the returns that we need. So I'm going to kind of pause there, and then I'll come back later. Let me just mention something else that was mentioned earlier about the database for qualified candidates for boards throughout this country. About 6-7 years ago, CalPERS was charged, the staff was charged with making sure that there was more diverse representation on corporate boards. Staff came back with the update on their efforts, and they're saying that corporate America was telling them that we can't find candidates. So we said, we'll fix that. And we created what we refer to as 3D, which is a direct, diverse data source. And that tool now has over 400 qualified candidates of diverse backgrounds to serve on corporate boards. So then we went back and I asked for an update about 8 months ago and said, how is it going now that we have the candidates? And they said they couldn't find them. Now the response is, we don't have any openings. So we got to continue to deal with these corporations and say, well, okay, we've got to find a way to refresh your boards if that's the problem, because we strongly believe that long-term board membership creates a kind of commonplace situation, and we've indicated maybe some studies say 12 years or so, you kind of lose your independence. So you got board members now been serving on corporate boards for 20 years. So perhaps they need to do some refreshing and to get some of these diverse candidates on their board, the younger people, to serve on these boards. So that's another effort that we've made. And that database now has been turned over to Aguilar, and they're managing that. And I'll have a few comments on that a little later.
Thanks very much, Henry. So quickly, Henry and Michelle, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the companies that you are targeting. We've all read and have seen reports of you engaging or writing letters to or speaking with various companies about their board diversity or lack of diversity. So who are these companies that you're targeting? Are they companies with no women, for example, or how are you selecting the companies that you are targeting and going after, at least as far as your initial cut?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay. So sure. We're looking at a number of sub-tiers of the corporate community, and the key thing being, to Henry's point, is there a lack of turnover? Because a lack of turnover generally indicates poor board practices in the first place. Given the fast pace of business change, you would expect companies to be bringing in new directors on a pretty regular basis because the needs of the board may be changing. But we have started on gender diversity simply because in the US there has been so little progress compared to the rest of the world, and because there is no threat of a quota. But the really important thing is getting back to this point I made about the nominating process and making that more robust. As soon as boards make a commitment to look in different places, they find people across multiple dimensions of diversity. And so it isn't singly about gender, but gender is actually something that's relatively easy to sort on, and something that we have been discussing with boards for quite some time. This year, and we're just in the process of doing this, we are writing to 200 companies that have no women directors or only one woman director, to tell them that we will be voting against their entire nominating committee at the next AGM unless they make a credible change within the next 6 to 9 months. And that's not to say they have to find a director in that time, but they have to make a commitment to a time period when they're going to enhance the diversity on their board. But I think, as Henry said, one of the key things is starting to refresh some of these boards that just really are homogenous and ossified.
Yes, I would just like to add that in January of 2017, CalPERS sent to the S&P 500 companies that we had determined that had a lack of board diversity, and we actually engaged with 94 of those companies. And we strongly believe that engagement is the right approach, because there's some individuals that say, well, let's don't invest in them. If you don't invest in them, you lose your seat at the table. So we believe that engagement is the proper approach to do it. We also sent letters to 504 companies that are in the Russell 3000 and using the same approach because we had information that they lacked diversity. And then you get to the IPOs, it's even worse because when those companies go public, they already have their boards. So it's even less diverse members on those boards as they go. And then they continue to bring in the friends of theirs when they were private companies. So it's a constant area that we need to continue to address.
Sorry to come back on this, but I think there's another really important reason to engage rather than just vote or write letters, and that is that, again, the companies that don't want to change have a really nice long list of excuses. And one of them is supply. Another one is we don't need a diverse board. We're not a consumer-facing company. And so it's coming back to this point that we really try and hit home really hard with these companies, that this is about long-term sustainability, about financial performance, about the quality of board decision-making, and a company's ability to attract talent. It isn't anything other than those things. And that, you know, the excuses are no longer palatable.
Right. Thank you. So Michelle Hooper, you are. Michelle is shy, as you can tell. You're a director. You're facing pressures from different angles now on this board diversity issue, from members of Congress on one hand, from shareholders on another. What's going on? What's going on in the boardroom in response to that?
So, quite frankly, I think there's some fallacies around what happens in the boardroom and the approach that we take, and I say we because I've been a director now for almost 27 years, in terms of who sits at those, you know, precious 9 to 12 seats that happen around that table. I do think that this issue that keeps cropping up about board refreshment, I do think, I hate that word refreshment, but anyway, I do think that open slots on boards are a opportunity, but I will tell you, it is not a necessity for boards to put diverse candidates in there, because if it was, we'd have more diversity on boards. And if you look at, I had sat on a board, was mentioned earlier, AstraZeneca in the UK, until the last probably 4 years, when they threatened to put quotas into the UK with their 9-year term limits, constantly had, through mandatory turnover, open slots. And I will tell you, the UK did not have an overabundance of diversity on their boards until the threat of mandatory quotas being put in on women. And all of a sudden, they're now finding women. So just because we have open slots and just because we have a process by which to increase turnover in the boardroom does not mean that these boards will be filling them with us. So unless there is something done very proactively to make that happen, please do not think that because there's a focus on women that people of color and different ethnicities will be pulled through on those coattails. If that were the case, we would be seeing a slight uptick in the people of color and diversity now. And actually those numbers are flat to declining. So that's the reality. So we have to figure out how do we get those doors open. Now, there's going to be natural turnover and a great opportunity through open slots. I read a study about a year ago that said that 20% of public board seats are held by individuals that are 68 years of age or older. 20%. And that, you may or may not know, the average retirement age at about 50% of companies have term limits. You need to know all these things. We have mandatory retirement ages of 72 years. Those mandatory retirement ages are now being crept up to 75 years, okay? Because we're all baby boomers and we're going to live forever. So, but you have these are important numbers to know. 20% that are 68 years, either a 72-year retirement or 75. And so in the next 5 to 7 years, there will be naturally a significant turnover of board seats. So that does present an opportunity, but it is not going to be simply because that opportunity is there that we will get our fair share of those open slots. So second point or third or whatever, there needs to be a process by which boards begin to not only seek additional pools by which we look for candidates, because the reality is that the majority, 70%, 80% of our seats are indeed still done through who we know and what the networks are of the people sitting around that table. Doesn't lead to a huge opportunity for diversity. So that says we need to have additional, and it's not going to come through rulemaking, so I think over the next 4 years we have to disabuse ourselves of that notion and figure out what is it that we can do to make those things happen. At lunch I was telling Michelle, because she was here, and Henry, as a director, it's only going to happen if our shareholders, if our investors keep the heat on boardrooms in terms of both not only sending letters and engaging with us, but holding us accountable by how we vote. That is the only thing. What is measured in corporate America, and you all that are in corporate America know this, what is measured, it's done. And if you don't measure it, it's not going to get done. The other thing is that a lot of times in corporations, and I hear this all the time because I get around, the issue that we have is if we don't hear it, it's not real. And so therefore, you hear more and more in corporations, well, my shareholders aren't saying this. My shareholders don't see that as a priority. It has to become a shareholder priority, I think, in order for us to really try to make progress. I think, that probably slides this way. I do think there are some leading edge boards out there that are doing the right thing and that are managing through. It all starts with the long-term strategic plan, financial value of the corporation. And it also says, what are the skill sets that are needed and the experience needed in those 9 to 12 people that are sitting around the table. And I think, and I'll get on my soapbox now for things that I think boards should be doing, not only using a skills matrix, which takes it out away from the who do you know, which quite frankly a lot of our boards still get caught up in, but it says these are the skills that I need. And then being able to identify the individuals who might be candidates, but that's still not good enough. Because identifying candidates does not necessarily mean that we are going to accept them, because there's such a thing as culture and fit. And let me tell you, that's knocked out more than one wonderful person. I personally hope that boards can go to a recruiting rule, which means all slates need to be diverse slates, and all of this nonsense about I can't find needs to be put to bed. And I personally like the notion of what I call blind auditions, which means before you start going to, I want to knock this person out, let's take this particular person off the potential candidate slate. You say, you go through a whole laundry list of why they should be one. And if you think about the orchestras today, orchestras have a lot of their string sections. I love orchestras. I go to the Chicago Symphony a lot. It used to be the Chicago Symphony string sections for Middle Eastern ethnicity white men, old white men, unfortunately. Beautiful, beautiful
for levity here. If I was going to go for a board interview for the curriculum, I can't get rid of my Texas accent.
That's a different type of ice. That's a different type of ice. But just to add a couple of numbers, I happen to see that to Michelle's statement we know, 2016 in its Big Four survey, 82% of the board seats were filled by female, and only 17% by search looking for a particular set of skills, attributes, or diversity. So that covers the reality. The line of issues also have to be done right. For example, numbers are curtain actually put carpets on the way to where your seat is, and they can't tell if your heels on or regular shoes. So it's
If you can do it, so you take out the bias, the inherent bias.
of course, you got to take the accent.
I'm starting to get the wrap-up music from our hosts here. So I want to quickly thank my panel, Henry Jones, Mr. Aguilar, Michelle Hooper, Michelle Atkins for being
You're
here.
not going to be on Sterling K. Brown. You're just going to let the music go there. Anybody watch the Emmy?
Again, I want to thank you all for being here. Really appreciate you.
They're trying to get your attention before you leave. I think he wanted to say something about the next panel is not over.
Yes, we just heard on the regulatory and corporate policy side, and this next panel is going to be really great. We're going to hear directly from folks that sit on boards of directors about how they're advocating for an inside strategy. And so I invite all the panelists to come up, and I want to introduce your moderator for this panel. His name is Lauren Douglas, who is the alpha, as far as I've been informed, and managing director at BN Watermelon, where he manages enterprise-wide relationships within the bank and asset management sectors.
Okay, before we get started, let me, how much time do we have? We want to manage this properly. We have a lot of great things. Okay. Okay. We all set? Good afternoon, everybody. Hope we still got you. We still got your attention. Yeah, okay. We're going to take a little different path this time. The previous panel talked about the policy and the governance around corporate boards. What we're going to talk about today are the pathways. How do you even get there? And which is probably the biggest mystery. The previous panel alluded to a lot of the data that suggests that boards tend to come from director networks and so forth. But we're going to kind of delve into what the life of a director is like, as well as how you get there. I have the pleasure of presenting to you 4 outstanding directors that will be our guides in this conversation this afternoon. In addition to their preeminent qualifications, which I'm going to read briefly, we've assembled a panel with broad industry reach with diverse career expertise and experience. So by way of introductions, I'd like to introduce you the following panelists. Immediately to my left is Singleton Mcallister, an accomplished attorney and an expert in government relations and public policy law. Singleton represents companies and trade associations in a wide range of industries in matters related to international trade, transportation, energy, and healthcare. Singleton has served on the boards of Alliant Energy, a public utility holding company. She's been there since 2001, and United Rentals, the largest equipment rental company in the world, and she's been there since 2004. Immediately to her left is Al Zoller, currently executive partner with Cirrus Capital Group. Al retired from a very successful 34-year career at IBM, where he held several multi-billion-dollar businesses, where he ran several multi-billion-dollar businesses, such as the venerable IBM Lotus, the iSeries hardware platform, and the Tivoli software business for data center management, and one of the precursors to cloud computing. Al's previous and current board memberships include Chubb Insurance, PSE&G, Stratus Technologies, and Pulse Secure, the latter two companies being Cirrus portfolio companies. Next to Al, we have Marcia Sims, who's a retired partner at the international law firm Weil, Gotshal & Manges. With over 30 years experience, Marcia's principal practice areas were bank finance and corporate debt restructurings. Marcia's clients came from a very interesting cross-section of retail, home fashions, art, telecom, and energy sectors. Marcia sits on the board of Sotheby's, the oldest company on the New York Stock Exchange, having been founded in 1744. And last, but not least, is Lloyd Trotter, founder and managing partner of Gen X 360 Capital Partners. In 2008, Lloyd capped an outstanding 40-year career at General Electric, where his last position was vice chairman, making him the highest-ranking executive in the entire company. And in fact, I think you may have been the highest-ranking black executive ever at GE, Lloyd. Lloyd's specialty is leading and managing large manufacturing and industrial businesses. His current and former board assignments included PepsiCo, Textron, Meritor, and my favorite is Daimler. So we have to talk about that Maybach after this is over, Lloyd. So before we get started, first of all, let's give a hand to our panelists. The depth and breadth of this panel is simply extraordinary. As you can see, we have a variety of interests, as expertise, and so forth. Surely we'll learn a whole lot from them. But before we really get into the pathways discussion, let's start off by citing a few stats. We're going to talk about the Fortune 500. There are 5,440 board seats in the Fortune 500. In 2016, black men held 306 of those seats. Black women held 122 of those seats, for a total of percentage of about 7% of that 5,400. White men, in contrast, held 3,763 of those seats. White women held 893 of those seats. And for your reference, that's more seats than everybody, all the other groups combined. Since 2012, 5 years ago, there's been much progress. There has not been much progress, excuse me. That's a different panel in a different year. That's 20 years from now. Black men have gained only 3 of seats out of that 5,440, and while black women have gained 19 of those seats. So percentage-wise, black men gained 1%, so roughly flat. Black women, roughly 5% increase. White women, on the other hand, have gained 156 seats, which again far exceeds all others combined. Harvard's Business Review reported in 2013 article that 48% of the board surveyed had a formal process, skills, and attributes evaluation of evaluating new directors. So I want to kind of use that as a backdrop. So before we kind of get into the pathways, let's kind of start off with the obvious question is, what do directors do, and why is he or she important? So Lloyd, would you take that one for us?
Well, 2 things. Number one, you're really guiding the company on how to effectively return shareholder value. That's the ultimate goal of a board. Now, saying that, you also have to be the conscience of the company that really drives what I call the values of the company. When you look at some of the boards I've been on, all of the boards I've been on, African Americans buy their products. You know, so it stands to reason that African Americans should be on the board. You cannot be on a board and be a shrinking violet around what you see. As vendors come in, whether it's accountants or whatever, if they don't reflect the values of the company, you have to go. You cannot play the game well if you don't understand the game they're playing. As an example, in Europe, on the Daimler Mercedes board, only African American, I expected that. What I didn't expect was to be the only U.S. citizen on that board, and we're their second largest market on Germany. Something's wrong with that. What I also didn't expect, that they passed a law that I think will impede the progress of African Americans over the law was a gender-biased law. 40% of the board has to be women over a certain period of time. That law, even though it's not a law, is coming to the U.S. And what that does is we stop measuring diversity as we know it. And the results are just speak for themselves. Lauren said. So we've got to understand the game, we have to understand how to play the game, and we have to understand our role in getting there.
So with that highly significant role, are there other multiplier effects by being a board member in terms of the executive core, in terms of their philanthropy? What are some of the other areas that board members have influence over that are quite tangible? Marsha, why don't you, or in Singleton, you can chime in on that as well.
I think one of the important ones, again, to give you an example, a few years ago, one of the big things that the boards do, and one of the most important, is to look at who is in the executive pipeline. Is our CFO somebody we think is long-term? If he gets hit by a truck, who's going to be there to step into his place? We made one of these reviews, I guess, on Sylvie's board 7 years now, about 5 years ago, under our former CEO. And at the end of the review, other than people in our Hong Kong office, there were no people of color. And I said, probably I could have been a little more diplomatic, I said, you know, this is the whitest company I've ever been. And I represented Fortune 100 companies all the time, and when I walked in the door, the two doormen were black, and the lady who took the door, and that was it. And so I said, what are we going to do about this? The CEO turned right then and is not very happy about it. For a variety of reasons, he's no longer with us. Our new CEO was very interested in diversity. And I made it clear to him that I was interested in diversity too. And I'm very happy to announce that our last two senior vice president hires were both black people. I won't say that for me, but I think if someone said you have to, the tone comes from the top. And between our CEO and between me sort of saying, okay, so you got to show what you said you were going to do, I think you're going to do.
And one of those hires is a good friend of mine. That was a great hire. It's a great hire. Singleton, please.
To follow up with Marsha's point on both boards that I've been on, I've also had the opportunity to serve as the chair of the Compensation and Personnel Committee. Compensation. So as a result, I made sure that one of the metrics or evaluation measures was put in the performance plan of our CEO to respond to, it comes from the top. And I think Michelle mentioned it earlier, when you talk about diversity, and one of the things I wanted to make sure that we as a board and committee got a chance to look at our employee profile. Don't give me that overall margin number, bring it down. I mean, who are the women, who are Hispanics, who are black, etc. But you'll get a skew on that, and you see the real deal. And not just the personnel and compensation, but the other thing that I was very much interested in, where was our supplier who are we spending our dollars with? I mean, what kind of vendors are we using? And I wanted that broken down. And if you're not at that table, and you're not in those committees, and you're not asking those questions, others may or may not. So as a Black board member, you know, I thought it was my responsibility to ask those questions. When I got my first board, I said, "Oh, the only woman, the only Black." She said, "Yeah, but make sure you're not the last one."
So that's very interesting. So what you're saying is being on a board, which is representing the shareholders' interest, you actually have impact further down and away from the company, even to suppliers, in which many of those suppliers could be Black business and so forth. What about philanthropy? Is that also an area that a board would have influence over?
Oh, yeah, with United Rentals, in the area of the veterans is a big area that we picked up. We're one of the largest contributors in the social homes and dollars that go in that space. I talked to them about making sure the HBCUs that were represented in the Aguilar because, you know, I didn't hear anyone else asking those questions.
Right.
So, you know, so you won't get everything that you ask for, but at least you bring it to their attention and make sure that as those dollars go out, that we're identifying the communities that look like us as well.
So this board thing is really a strategic effort that we are clearly it's got wide-reaching implications. Now let's talk about how board members are selected, especially given that it's such a strategic bless you. Especially since it's such a strategic place to be in a corporation. Let's talk about the selection process. Al, why don't we tell us a little bit about how you came to your first board and how you've seen it change, if any, during your board service?
I'll get to that. I want to make one comment about the role of the board. It's also, as Lloyd alluded to, creating shareholder value, and that's through strategic and oversight, through oversight of strategy and risk.
Right.
And I think people don't talk enough about the lack of diversity as a risk to the enterprise.
Interesting.
The Black Enterprise just put out a nice issue on African Americans on corporate boards. And it listed those 300 Fortune 500 companies that have African Americans, at least one on the board. But it also listed the 200 who don't. Interesting names, Netflix, Cisco, PayPal, Amazon. And now I happen to know that some of these firms have been very actively looking for African American board members. I know one situation where a person, for different reasons, chose not to continue with them. But, you know, what would happen if all Black folks stopped Netflix and chill? What would that do to the company relative to the profile of that company? So again, it's a risk management dimension to this as well. Now,
great point.
In terms of how the process works, it's really generally the nominating the governance committee that's got the responsibility. In the case of my first board assignment, Chubb, an insurance company, a fellow who was well known to a lot of folks, Jim Cash, professor emeritus at Harvard Business School, board member then at Chubb, but also Microsoft, Walmart, and GE, was on the nominating governance committee. I just become president and CEO of the subsidiary of IBM Lotus Development Corporation. He reached out to me to see if I would be interested in. Interestingly, I mean, at the time I had a policy of not allowing anybody to be on the board, but fortunately for me, they had just hauled me into the audit committee and chewed me out because the division I'd just taken over had never passed an audit, even though I was not there when they didn't pass the audits. And so Chubb wanted to put me on the audit committee, and I told IBM maybe I'll learn something if I get an experience with another firm. So
did it work?
Yeah, it worked. It did work. But the real point is that nominating and governance committee is really a key fulcrum for these decisions. And just as has been said, a good nominating and governance committee will have its list of candidates on an ongoing basis. So there should be a pipeline that they're thinking about. But I'll tell you, having sat on some of these committees, it's mostly filled with people that the Nominating Governance Committee members know. Now, fortunately, Jim Cash is African American, he knew me, and I got to be on the Jim board. So one of the things that I talk to and coach people who are interested in being on boards about is all the time is that this is all public information. Go to the web. If there's any companies or industries you're interested in, Google them. Google their directors. Google who's on the Nominating Governance Committee. And my guess is you'll know somebody. You don't know somebody on that committee. You know somebody who knows somebody or knows somebody. It's going to be a few degrees of separation. And again, that's how you get on that 80% of people that the board knows.
And I think it's always easy. I sit on our nominating committee, and for a variety of reasons, we have been constrained as to who we are choosing. But at one point, because part of our business is Asian related, we decided we wanted someone from China and asked the headhunter to bring us candidates. The headhunter gave us, I think, 15 candidates, and 14 of them were men. And so I said to the head of the nominating committee, how come we aren't seeing any more women? And he said, oh, I haven't noticed. So I think it's the same thing as we notice when there are no black folk on the list. But white men don't pay any attention to those kinds of things. And you know, when the minute I said it, he said, you're right. And the next set of candidates we saw had a lot more women. So again, it was not one of those, there are plenty of people out there, it's just where you look.
You know, I think one of the common things you're hearing is that once on a board, you cannot become a Switzerland Bible. You have got to advocate for what you believe is right. That's diversity on the board. Unless a company changes its process, it will never change the results. And unless you give that board of congressmen thought that maybe what you're doing isn't getting you the results, you won't happen.
Lloyd, please go right ahead.
No, I was just going.
This is great. I love
I was
this.
just going to add.
Making my job easy.
Now, I was just going to have several nominating committees as well. Oftentimes, as you go in those committee rooms, they're asking, okay, well, so-and-so's leaving, it's going to be an open slot. What are we looking for? Okay, where's the business right now? We're missing a CFO. Or do we need financial expertise? Do we need a lawyer? Do we need another CEO? Do we need somebody who has regulatory experience? Do we need cybersecurity right now? For obvious reasons, it's a sought after area for a lot of boards, for people in that regard. So as we go through that matrix scale as to what that individual should be, as earlier mentioned, and one of the things a lot of these large corporations like to do is go to the search firms if they're doing it the right way, not the little void ways like getting, Bubba's friend from Corporation X to join. And now the shareholders are being more active and proactive in that regard. So when you go to the search firms, I mean, to the earlier point, you have to stay on them because they have their list of folks that they've known for a long time, and a lot of them don't look like us. And as a result, you got to push back. We've done this several times. And having done that, that's one way. Those of you who are interested in doing board work, the search firms are one way to go after. Another way is the whole networking, as you mentioned earlier. Look for public knowledge, who's there, who's on, Company X's, list. Make that relationship move forward in that direction. Another group is the Executive Leadership Council. They right now have an ongoing program where they're doing searches for their members in that regard. The magazine that was just responded to with the Black Enterprise with John Rogers, Area Capital. We now have regional groups around the country, Black Corporate Directors Conference, because we get together once a year in the summer, and I think we had 250 members in Laguna Beach just a few weeks ago. And as you look around that room, we see a lot of the members are older, and they'll, as mentioned earlier, there's that age requirement to cap off. So in those meetings, we say, listen, be serious about going out, doing the outreach in your particular regions, and getting folks, if they aren't on boards, get on board ready. And we can talk about that a little later too. But as far as what's going on in the community right now. The earlier panel you heard was going on with regard to Congress moving forward, asking us questions. What happened in 2008, 2009, the Security Exchange Commission has got it, and what the shareholders are asking as well. We hear that before at home. I mean, I go back to my boards and tell them what I see going on, but I don't think that it resonates with a lot of folks. And if we're not going to tell them, and all of us being active in that regard, we really do need to ante up our representation.
So in terms of the pipelines, we talked about the ELC, we talked about a couple of other routes that people can investigate in terms of being involved in. For the purpose of education, two authors, Bill Donahoff and Richard Weigenhaft, back in 2006 published a book, Minorities in the Diversity Elite, talked about there tend to be 7 pathways for African Americans to corporate boards, and they are as follows. One is academia, college presidents and deans and so forth, senior administrators. Top of black-owned businesses, civil rights organizations, the Urban League, NAACP, large corporate lawyers of big prestigious law firms, like we have 2 of them here today. Management consulting, which is a fairly new route. The one that's least traveled by African Americans is senior level corporate executives, like Al and Lloyd. There are 2 other areas that tend to be the purview of what white males have gotten to boards, and that is one is born into a family that is part of the founding of the company, as well as, like I said, the senior executive route on the boards. Now, with that as a backdrop, and we talk about being in the right networks, just in August, if I could be a little contrarian, a noted Wharton professor wrote an article, and I think I heard about this from you, Marcia, and that is, it's called Good News for Young Strivers, Networking is Overrated. Harvard Business Review just in 2013 published an article that said, while 48% of the Fortune 500 have a rigorous process evaluating directors, 52% don't. So what do? How do we, if networking is overrated, how do we get there? Marcia, why don't you tackle that?
Well, the article basically said it's not who you know, what you do. And I think for black people it's both. Because going back to that list of Lauren read, that is what black directors looked like 10 years ago when those were the criteria. I think now most boards are sitting saying, I need somebody who knows X. I need somebody who knows, meaning knowledge and skill set. And you're not going to look at the university professor, you're not going to look at the civil rights organization, you're going to look at 2 men who look like 2 men sitting aside, on either side of me. Who's run business? Who understands shareholder value? Who understands return on investment? I must say, as a lawyer, it took me a while to put in my head return on investment, which is why people don't like lawyers. I won't go into that. But I think that the answer is you need to figure out how do you get the skills that boards are looking for. I remember reading another article one time, how do you get ahead? You do the hard job that nobody else wants to do, and you do it better than anybody else would have done. If you do that, people will recognize you. The CEOs who are sitting on my board are always talking about the hot young things in their organizations. They want to promote those people. They want them to go serve on another board. So I think what I'm saying, and respect what everybody else is saying, you got to have something to offer a board, and it's got to be more than being black.
Interesting.
You know, one of the things that we taught our young African Americans in General Lecture was it was actually a seminar that was developed by someone by me called PI, Performance, Image, and Exposure. And
Harvey Coleman is his name.
Right.
The
interesting thing about it, particularly for African Americans, is that show me someone who is an overachiever, and actually He wasn't overachiever. 5 years, he was the best sales individual. 3 out of the 5 years, but he never got the move. He kept his head to the grindstone, did his job, did it very, very well. He developed this whole theory about is performance the only factor in growing the career, and it's not. Image and exposure is just as important, maybe more important. Performance will get you fired if you don't get it. It won't necessarily get you promoted. So I think you have to sort of more or less level the playing field on the image and exposure piece of it, and you have to play all three of those lanes in order to be successful. The other thing you got to do is, I'm a firm believer coming out of operations that you measure, you get what you measure. You know, so I'm chair of the compensation committee. I was on PepsiCo, and I am on Textron. And one of the things that we did, and I pushed for, which causes us to have to talk about diversity, is their compensation. Their long-term incentive plan has a portion of it tied to diversity. You want to get paid? Get it done. You don't want to get paid? Don't bother. But we have to talk about it. We have to talk about, did we move the needle? And are we proud of what we did? You know, in that particular case. So it's about process, and it's about preparedness and having a pipeline of individuals so that you never hear, I can't find them. You know, it's sort of, when we started our project, I was out fundraising, and I was with high net worth individuals in Boca Raton, Florida. And my firm, the founders are all African American. And we were there, and one of the questions was, is this going to be an all African American firm? And I quickly said, no, it's not. My firm would like to be the head of diversity, and we want just great people. And here's where you can help me. I can't find qualified white folks. There was a nervous laugh. I mean, I wanted to say that so long. We can't let that happen. You know, you are on boards and you're advocating for diversity. We have got to be a part of the solution, not just the voice that's crying in the wind for change. We've got to change the process.
I would say last month, I told one of our HR people who was talking about senior level hires, and she said, we ask our headhunters to give us qualified black people. I said, do not put the word qualified in front of black people. You don't ask for qualified white people. And she said, but they don't send us good candidates otherwise. I said, well, then that's the problem with headhunters. You know, find a different firm, but you know, everybody wants to hire qualified people of all.
I can just make a comment to tie this together, maybe challenge a little bit your the premise that this networking is dead. I think this is all at the end of the day about push and pull. You know, whatever you're looking for, people who perform, and people who perform get pushed. You know, ahead by the sponsors that understand and believe in their performance. Pull comes from the network of people who understand your reputation. Again, it's back to the pie point. Your ability to contribute. Now, if that's a really small network, there's going to be a lot of pull. If it's a large network, you know, there's going to be more force associated with that pull. And so the same thing, and by the way, this applies to, you know, whatever setting you're in. You know, if you're an entry-level worker or you're a senior executive, you know, this is a way to think about your career, but it certainly applies when you get to a committee like a nominating and governance committee. You know, the reputation that people have once their names go into that slate, the reaction, if people have heard, you know, yeah, I've heard of that guy. Oh, I read an article someplace about a speech that she made. That creates that force of pull. So again, networking does matter, but it's not just about showing up and handing out business cards. It's about making sure those forces of push and pull are working.
So you actually, that view is kind of consistent with both what Marcia and Lloyd had to say. Because Lloyd, who for artists is edification.
I've learned I should always agree with Lloyd.
I always agree with Lloyd too. Having worked at GE. Harvey Coleman, that Lloyd was talking about, has written a book called The Empowerment Game Revealed. Go to Amazon. Harvey Coleman's thesis is PI, performance, image, exposure. 10% of your success is due to performance. Why? Because everybody has it. All the top players have it. So you're not distinguishing yourself by a performance. Image is 30% in terms of, what's that from a marketing sense? What's your brand? What's your brand equity? Something you can control. 60% is exposure, which is what Al and Lloyd and Marcia have been, and also Singleton have also been saying. So that networking thing is still a key component, even though you got skills. Harvard Business Review in 2013 wrote an article that they evaluated boards. They looked at where the missing skill sets were, as well as where their strongest skills. You may be interested to know the strongest skill sets in the boards they surveyed was industry knowledge, strategy, financial, and audit, made up 70%, and there were many other topics that were in single digits. However, where they figured out where their gaps were, and maybe we can get our board members to comment on that, technology, HR and talent management, which we know that the African Americans are heavily represented in the HR core in corporations, international and global experience, as well as succession planning. Industry knowledge and sales and marketing fall below those. In terms of influence on the executive pipeline, in terms of any advice you can give, and we already heard a kernel of advice, you adopt something nobody else wants to do and really run with it. What would you suggest in terms of our audience, how they can position themselves to be seen as a resource to fill an empty board seat? Anybody?
I think your analysis about the 30% image, brand, industry knowledge are spot on. And for those who are interested in serving on boards, I mean, we talk about networking, that is at every level. And it's about your brand too. I mean, if you're an expert in a certain area, make sure you're writing those articles, you're trying to get slots on TV. Because if folks recognize you as an expert in that particular area, then you're a safe bet, right? I mean, they will go to you and say, oh yeah, you mentioned that earlier. I've heard of, Miss So-and-so before. Yeah, let's bring her in. Let's see what that's all about. And as that open slot comes up, and what other areas they're looking for, we have to make sure that you, whatever those areas may be, that you're considered an expert in that respective area. Having said that, I don't want to deviate too much, but I think, and we'll get back to this discussion as well. I'm sure my colleagues have something to say as well. But every board has what they call a strategic planning meeting every year, once a year, and it's usually around the summer and the spring. We figure out, what's going to be the 2020 vision, the 2018 vision, the 2030 vision of the company and where we want to go. Having said that, when you look at boards, I mean, that's long term, but they want to make sure they're having the right kind of people and skill sets that fit those areas. And from that perspective, that board member is hoping to drive shareholder value, and they should bring that perspective to help that company do just that. One of the alarming things, and I guess I should have known, that I learned a few weeks ago at one of our strategy meetings, is that millennials, as we all know, think very differently from a lot of us. And as a result, in 2030, they're going to be the majority of the consumer-based population of what's moving forward in that direction. We just brought